May it please the court. My name is Rachel Verheg, and along with my co-counsel Sydney Snyder, for Team 39, we represent the respondent, State of Wissota. I will be addressing the legislature's proper audit of Mr. Bailey's BlackBerry, while my co-counsel will be addressing the lawful search of Mr. Bailey's laptop. The legislature's audit of Mr. Bailey's BlackBerry was constitutional for several reasons. First, Mr. Bailey had no reasonable expectation of privacy because he signed in acknowledgement of the legislature's formal policy governing his BlackBerry. He explicitly waived his right to privacy and accepted a monthly audit of the contents of his device. Second, even if Mr. Bailey had a reasonable expectation of privacy, the legislature had a non-investigatory, work-related justification in conducting a cost-benefit analysis. Finally, the scope of the legislature's audit was reasonable because the legislature only audited the devices of those employees who had incurred overages, and there was no other feasible means of determining whether those overages were personal or work-related.
Well, your opponent seems to think there were reasonable means to do that, just by excising personal things and finding how much is left. I mean, how do you answer that?
Are you talking about the monthly communications histories, Your Honor?
Yeah. Well, I thought your opponent said that there were other ways that you could do this without actually reading the text messages. But you are seeming to say that that's not true.
No, that's not true, Your Honor, because what's important is that the legislature get an accurate determination of whether Mr. Bailey's text messages were personal or work-related. In regards to, for example, Mr. Bailey mentioned redacting his text messages, that is not an accurate means for the legislature to obtain the information that it needed.
Why?
Because Mr. Bailey, redacting his text messages, it would still be difficult for the legislature to be able to tell truly whether they were personal or work-related, depending on the amount of redaction and that type of thing. Well, the legislature could have obtained a character count.
They could read all the ones that aren't redacted, right? And confirm that those were work-related. Is that going to be difficult?
It would be difficult because just because Mr. Bailey contacted somebody, say, in another state office, it does not mean that the phone call or the text message was work-related. And so if we're just looking at, what would be considered work-related depending upon, who he contacted and that type of thing, we would not get to the heart of whether those messages were personal or work-related because of just who he had contacted and, what Mr. Bailey chose to redact. Mr. Bailey could not have reasonably expected privacy in his BlackBerry device because he specifically waived any expectation of privacy. In O'Connor versus Ortega, the United States Supreme Court further defined the operational reality standard to encompass actual office practices and procedures or legitimate regulation. Here we have a formal policy that is legitimate regulation that was consistently followed during Mr. Bailey's employment. Mr. Bailey would have never been allowed access to a BlackBerry in the first place had he not given up his reasonable expectation of privacy and consented to an audit of the contents of his device.
How often had they audited it how long had he been there? Or had this 4 years?
Yeah, about 4 years, Your Honor.
How often had they audited it?
Monthly, Your Honor.
And they did do that monthly?
It was indeed a monthly audit of the contents of his device pursuant to the formal policy.
And so this search or this audit was no different than all of those?
This audit was no different in the respect that it was a monthly audit of the device. The only difference being that the legislature looked at the contents of Mr. Bailey's text messages, whereas prior to that,
Did
the
they do
legislature...
that every month?
Not every month, Your Honor, nor does the policy specifically say that they would have to do that every month.
Okay, and I apologize if I wasn't being precise. How often had they done a search like this one in the 4 years that Mr. Bailey had the BlackBerry?
The record does not indicate that any other employee's device, that the text messages on any other employee's device was audited. However, there was an audit that occurred of an aide's BlackBerry upon a senator's request. And that, in addition to the audit of Mr. Bailey's text messages upon request of the Budget and Finance Committee, basically shows that Senator Romero had never really established any sort of informal policy. And he was, in fact, when he was asked to do these audits, he did them. So even if there was a formal policy, or an informal policy rather, the policy was not consistently followed. Senator Romero was simply doing his job as he was supposed to do under the formal policy. In addition, employees were put on notice that Senator Romero was being appointed to conduct audits of the BlackBerry devices pursuant to the formal policy. And if there was no formal policy that was being established here, then there would have been no reason to appoint Senator Romero and no reason to conduct any audits. In addition, several circuits have held that an employer's formal policy regarding use of electronic devices outweighs an employee's claimed expectation of privacy. For example, the Eighth Circuit in United States v. Thorne held that Mr. Thorne, in signing an acknowledgement of his employer's formal policy, waived his reasonable expectation of privacy. Likewise, in United States v. Angevine, Mr. Angevine was subject to a formal computer policy that monitored his access and the information he was sending over the network. And
the policy in this case states that the BlackBerry cannot be used for personal use, period. Is that right?
Yes, Your Honor. And
so if I send a text message to my daughter with one of these BlackBerries, I'm in violation of that policy. Is that correct?
Yes, Your Honor. It's only for state business.
And does the record show whether any people have been sanctioned or punished for personal use?
The record does not indicate that anybody has been punished for personal use.
In fact, does the record establish that it's commonly used, that many people use it for personal use? That they're doing this audit to find out how many text messages are being done for personal use? Doesn't that imply that they're using it for other than state business quite a bit?
The audit was done to determine whether or not the overages were personal or work-related. However, the record does not indicate necessarily that employees were using the devices more for personal use than state business or anything of that nature. I mean, it implicitly, I suppose, says that there was some personal use that was going on. However, the focus here was more on, are these overages work-related? And since the legislature was paying for those overages, they wanted to make sure that they were providing the best service possible within the financial bounds, considering the state budget crisis, providing the best service possible for their employees and also to save themselves money.